In this video, you'll see how a routine traffic stop quietly crossed the line.
We can handle this right here.
How authority applies pressure without ever raising its voice.
No paperwork, no report.
How implication becomes the real pattern.
The traffic stop occurred just after 9:40 p.m. on a warm Thursday night in a quiet Illinois suburb where serious crime was uncommon, and police encounters were usually uneventful. A black 2023 Rolls-Royce Ghost moved steadily along an empty 4-lane road bordered by closed retail stores and aging streetlights. The vehicle was immaculate, freshly detailed, temporary dealer plates still attached. Behind the wheel was Ethan Brooks, 41 years old, black, tall, and solidly built. His posture was rigid in a way that never fully leaves someone after years of military service. He was still wearing elements of his Marine Corps dress uniform, having just left a formal veterans charity event. The medals on his chest were visible in the reflection of the dashboard lighting. Mounted discreetly behind the rearview mirror was a civilian dash camera Brooks had installed years earlier, back when he learned the value of documenting everything. The device activated automatically. Date, time, speed, interior audio, and forward-facing video were all being recorded without interruption. Red and blue lights appeared behind him without warning. Brooks slowed, signaled, and pulled over smoothly. The dash camera would later show no speeding, no lane drift, no mechanical issue. The reason entered into the patrol system afterward would be vague, recorded simply as an investigative stop.
All right, evening. Everything good tonight?
Evening. Yes, sir.
Where are you headed from?
Just came from an event downtown.
Nice ride you've got here.
Thank you.
All right, hang tight a second.
Two uniformed officers approached the vehicle. One moved to the driver's side window, the other positioned himself slightly behind and to the right. Their movements were relaxed, confident, familiar, the kind of ease that comes from repetition. The officer at the window spoke first. His tone was casual, almost friendly. He asked where Brooks was coming from. He commented briefly on the car. He glanced at the uniform and did not acknowledge it. Brooks answered calmly and handed over his license and registration when requested. Everything checked out within moments. That should have been the end of it. Instead, the officer leaned closer and lowered his voice. The second officer stepped back just far enough to appear uninvolved, though he remained fully visible on camera.
So here's the situation. You didn't technically do anything wrong, but stops like this can still go a few different directions depending on how long we want to sit out here. That can mean inspections, delays, sometimes towing, stuff that takes time.
What followed was not ambiguous. The officer explained clearly and audibly that although Brooks had not technically broken a traffic law, situations like this could go a few different directions. He mentioned inspections, extended roadside delays, possible towing, administrative holds that could last hours. He spoke as if these were inconveniences, not punishments, and suggested they could be avoided depending on how Brooks chose to proceed.
All right, I'm trying to help you out here. We can handle this right now. No paperwork, no report. You go on your way. We don't sit out here all night. It's going to cost a bit, but it's a lot cheaper than having this car tied up.
Then came the offer. The officer stated in plain language that the matter could be handled right here. He referenced a cash amount significant enough to be taken seriously, framed as a private resolution that would never be documented. He assured Brooks that if the payment was made, there would be no report, no citation, and no further trouble. The dash camera captured everything. The words, the pauses, the expectation hanging in the air. Brooks did not raise his voice. He did not argue. He asked a single question, steady and direct, and it was recorded clearly. "What law did I break, officer?" There was a brief silence. The officer did not answer the question. Instead, he repeated that Brooks should think carefully about how much inconvenience he wanted to create for himself. The implication was unmistakable. The stop dragged on several minutes longer. No citation was issued. No supervisor was called. Eventually, the officers returned Brooks's documents and walked away. The patrol car pulled back into traffic. Brooks was allowed to leave. According to official records, the stop ended without incident. What those records did not show was that Brooks never turned off the camera. Within an hour, the footage was duplicated, secured, and delivered to the one place it could not quietly disappear. Once reviewed, it became immediately clear this was not a misunderstanding, not a gray area, and not an isolated lapse in judgment. It was evidence, and it raised a question that could no longer be ignored. If these officers were comfortable making that kind of offer while being recorded, how many times had they done it before when no one was watching? By the next morning, the traffic stop involving Ethan Brooks existed only as a short entry in the department's internal system. No citation issued, no warning logged, no narrative report attached, just an investigative stop cleared without incident. From the department's perspective, the matter was closed before it had officially begun. When questions surfaced later that week, the initial response followed a familiar pattern. A spokesperson described the encounter as a routine stop conducted in good faith. According to the department, officers had observed behavior they believed warranted further inquiry. They stated that no force was used, no search was conducted, and the driver was released promptly after cooperation was established. On paper, it sounded clean. Internally, supervisors treated it the same way. The two officers involved submitted short supplemental statements, nearly identical in tone. They claimed the driver had appeared nervous, that the vehicle drew attention due to its value, and that the stop was intended to verify registration and ensure public safety. Both officers denied making any improper statements. Both denied requesting or implying any form of payment. The case, they insisted, amounted to nothing more than a misunderstanding. What complicated that narrative was the existence of the recording. When Brooks submitted the dash camera footage through official channels, it was initially routed as a civilian complaint. That process alone delayed review. The footage sat unexamined for nearly 48 hours while Internal Affairs assessed whether the allegation met the threshold for formal investigation. During that time, the department's public stance hardened. Behind closed doors, senior staff discussed optics. There was concern about public perception, particularly given the visibility of the vehicle, the uniform Brooks had been wearing, and the broader climate surrounding police conduct. The early consensus was that the situation could be resolved quietly. A memo would be issued, a verbal reminder given, no disciplinary action required. That approach changed the moment the video was finally played in full. The audio was unmistakable. There was no ambiguity in the phrasing. The offer was not implied, not suggested, not inferred. It was spoken clearly enough that even without context, the intent was obvious. The language used mirrored phrases previously flagged in unrelated corruption cases, phrases that were never supposed to appear in legitimate traffic enforcement. The silence after Brooks's question was just as telling. Once the footage circulated internally, explanations began to shift. The officers' statements were revised slightly. Language was softened. Certain claims were walked back. The narrative moved from outright denial to careful reinterpretation. They argued the comments had been misunderstood, that they were hypothetical, that they were intended to de-escalate rather than intimidate. But the recording did not support that interpretation. What raised deeper concern was not just what was said, but how comfortable it sounded. The officer's tone carried no hesitation, no uncertainty. It sounded practiced, routine, like a script that had been used before and had worked. That realization triggered a broader review. Supervisors quietly began pulling prior stops involving the same officers. Patterns emerged quickly: high-end vehicles, short stops, minimal documentation. Discretion used frequently but inconsistently. Complaints that had gone nowhere. Drivers who never followed up or who chose not to push back. At the same time, Brooks was contacted by investigators and asked a question that reframed everything. Had this been the first time something like this had happened to him? His answer was no. He explained that he had encountered similar pressure before, though never this blatant, and never while his camera captured everything so clearly. He also explained why he chose not to confront the officers directly that night. Years of military service had taught him that escalation without leverage rarely ends well. The leverage, in this case, was the recording. As word of the footage spread quietly through internal channels, another issue surfaced. The stop had not occurred in isolation. It aligned with a series of unexamined complaints filed months earlier, complaints that had been dismissed individually, but now, when viewed together, formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. By the end of the week, the department's official version no longer matched what investigators were seeing. The story was starting to fracture. And the question was no longer whether the stop was improper, but how deep the behavior went and how long it had been quietly tolerated. The investigation changed direction the moment it stopped being handled quietly. Once Internal Affairs flagged the dash camera footage as credible evidence, the case was forwarded outside the department. That decision alone signaled that the situation was no longer viewed as a policy issue or a misunderstanding. It was treated as potential criminal conduct. Subpoenas followed quickly. Investigators began pulling traffic stop data going back 3 years, focusing on encounters involving high-value vehicles and discretionary releases. The pattern sharpened almost immediately. Certain stops ended abruptly with no paperwork. Certain drivers were never cited, never warned, never documented beyond a single line entry. In several cases, body camera footage was missing or incomplete, marked as corrupted or improperly uploaded.
I heard you're looking into those traffic stops. I didn't want to call, but I keep thinking about it. It was late. I was coming home from a private event. I wasn't speeding. They lit me up.
Then the first call came in. A man from a neighboring county contacted investigators after hearing about the inquiry through a local attorney. He described being stopped late at night while driving home from a private event. The officer had complimented his car, asked questions unrelated to traffic, and suggested that continuing the stop could create problems. The man said he paid several $1,000s in cash to avoid having his vehicle towed. At the time, he believed it was the only way out. He had never reported it. Within days, more calls followed. A small business owner described being pressured during a roadside stop after leaving a casino. A retired contractor recalled being threatened with an asset seizure that never materialized after a cash exchange. A rideshare driver spoke hesitantly about being stopped twice by the same officer and learning, the second time, what was expected of him. None of them knew each other. Their stories aligned anyway. What stood out was not just the similarity of the encounters but the language used, phrases repeated almost word for word, references to inconvenience, offers to resolve it now, assurances that nothing would be documented, the same calm delivery, the same absence of fear. Investigators began recording interviews. Most of the victims were reluctant at first, some feared retaliation. Others were embarrassed. A few believed they would be blamed for participating. They spoke quietly, often asking whether their names would become public. Several said the officers seemed to know exactly how far they could push without provoking resistance. One interview stood out. A middle-aged man described the officers' behavior as routine, not aggressive, almost polite. That detail mattered. It suggested the encounters were not improvised, they were practiced, comfortable, rehearsed. As evidence accumulated, search warrants were requested. Financial records revealed unexplained deposits, cash transactions inconsistent with reported income, and a pattern of spending that did not align with official salaries. Investigators noted frequent luxury purchases, private club memberships, and vehicles registered under family members' names. The scope widened. What had started as a single traffic stop now resembled an organized scheme. Investigators believed the officers were not acting impulsively. They were identifying targets, controlling the encounter, and extracting money with minimal risk. The absence of complaints had protected them, until now. Brooks was interviewed again, this time on camera. He described the stop in measured detail, focusing less on emotion and more on sequence. He explained why he had remained calm, why he did not challenge authority in the moment, why he let the officers believe the interaction had ended normally. He also confirmed something investigators already suspected. The offer made to him was not the first attempt. It was simply the first one caught cleanly, with audio and video, without room for reinterpretation. By the end of the month, internal containment was no longer possible. The case crossed jurisdictions. Federal oversight was requested. Prosecutors began preparing formal charges. Quietly, without announcement, the officers were placed on administrative leave. Publicly, nothing had changed yet. But behind the scenes, the investigation had crossed a line from inquiry to exposure. And once that line was crossed, there was no going back. The moment federal oversight entered the picture, the tone inside the department shifted. What had once been treated as an internal problem became a liability. Emails were preserved. Access logs were reviewed. Supervisors who had previously signed off on incomplete reports were now being asked to explain why. The quiet assumption that the situation could be contained no longer held. Investigators moved quickly. Search warrants were approved based on probable cause established through recorded audio, corroborated victim statements, and financial irregularities. The timing was deliberate. Early morning, minimal visibility, no advance warning. The first search took place at a suburban home less than 20 minutes from the station. The residence belonged to one of the officers. From the outside, it appeared unremarkable. Inside, it told a different story.
High-end clothing, racks full. Tags are still on most of them.
Make sure you get the serials.
Copy, cash. We'll count it later.
Closets contained designer clothing still bearing tags. Watches valued well above an annual police salary were stored in lockboxes. Receipts were recovered for luxury handbags purchased in cash, registered not to the officer, but to his spouse. A late-model SUV parked in the driveway was traced to a Shell registration tied to a relative.
Ma'am, we're here to execute a search warrant.
Okay.
This is for the premises, including storage areas. We'll be recording, all right?
Yeah.
These are registered to the spouse.
Log all jewelry.
The pattern repeated at the second location. More cash, more high-end items, more assets legally distanced from the officers themselves but functionally under their control. Investigators photographed everything. Serial numbers were logged. Storage units were identified and opened. The volume of seized property made it clear this was not supplemental income. It was systematic. While the searches were underway, pressure mounted elsewhere. Attorneys representing the officers requested delays. Union representatives questioned jurisdiction. Calls were made to city officials urging restraint. Some argued the evidence was being misinterpreted. Others suggested the investigation was politically motivated. None of that stopped the process. At the same time, investigators continued interviewing victims. One woman described watching her husband hand over cash during a stop while she sat silently in the passenger seat, afraid to speak. Another man recalled being told directly that reporting the incident would only make things worse for him. Several victims admitted they had initially believed the officers were acting within their authority, simply because of how confidently they spoke. Those interviews were recorded, faces were blurred, voices were altered. The substance remained intact. As the case expanded, a broader truth emerged. The officers had not targeted everyone. They selected drivers they believed were unlikely to challenge them, people with something to lose, people who would choose convenience over confrontation, people who assumed the system would side against them if they pushed back. That assumption had protected the scheme for years, until it didn't. By the time the warrants were executed, prosecutors were already drafting charges: extortion under color of law, conspiracy, financial crimes tied to undeclared income. Each charge carried consequences that could not be negotiated away. The officers were formally suspended, their weapons were surrendered, access badges deactivated, patrol vehicles reassigned. For the first time since the initial stop, the department issued a public statement acknowledging an active criminal investigation. The language was careful, neutral, it avoided specifics, but the implication was unmistakable. This was no longer about policy violations. It was about crimes committed while wearing a badge, and as details began to leak, public attention followed. Media inquiries increased, records requests flooded in. The story, once confined to internal memos and sealed interviews, was beginning to surface. What investigators understood, and what the officers were beginning to realize, was that the most damaging evidence had already been secured. It wasn't the luxury items, it wasn't the cash, it was the recording. Because once the public heard it, there would be no way to reframe what had happened on that roadside. What finally confirmed the scope of the scheme was not a new victim, but a mistake. While reviewing financial records tied to the officers' households, investigators noticed a recurring pattern that had initially gone overlooked. Several high-value purchases had been made within hours of specific traffic stops. The timing was too precise to dismiss as coincidence. Cross-referencing those transactions with patrol logs revealed a narrow window where cash exchanges were most likely to occur. One stop in particular stood out. It involved a driver who had never filed a complaint, never spoken to an attorney, and never contacted law enforcement. He had paid and moved on, but unlike the others, he had kept records, bank withdrawals, text messages to his spouse sent immediately after the stop. A vague explanation at the time, a clearer one later. When investigators reached out, he agreed to speak. He described the encounter calmly, almost clinically. The officers had approached his vehicle confidently. The conversation followed the same structure now familiar to investigators: no clear violation, an implied threat, an offer framed as assistance. He paid because he believed refusing would only escalate the situation. What he added changed everything. He explained that the officers had told him this was not a one-time arrangement. They implied that as long as he handled things properly, future encounters would go just as smoothly. It was presented as an understanding, not a transaction. That detail reframed the case. This was no longer opportunistic extortion. It was a system, one built on repetition, expectation, and silence. Investigators revisited the dash camera footage from Brooks with that context in mind. The language used by the officer suddenly carried a different weight. The confidence was not arrogance, it was familiarity. The officer spoke as someone who expected compliance because compliance had always come before. Additional evidence followed quickly. Recovered messages showed indirect coordination. Not explicit instructions, but patterns of communication before and after certain stops. Short calls, missed calls, timing that aligned too neatly to ignore. Investigators believed the officers were signaling each other, confirming whether a stop had produced or not. Then came the internal records. A review of deleted body camera files revealed intentional gaps, files marked as corrupted that had been manually interrupted, uploads delayed beyond policy limits, metadata that showed cameras had been turned away at critical moments. None of it could be explained as accidental. At this stage, prosecutors stopped using conditional language. Draft charging documents no longer said alleged. They laid out a clear theory of the case: abuse of authority, coordinated extortion, financial gain through intimidation, each element supported by independent evidence. The officers were notified through counsel. Their response was immediate. Statements were withdrawn, cooperation ended. Attorneys moved to suppress evidence, arguing procedural violations. They challenged jurisdiction. They questioned witness credibility. Those arguments did not survive scrutiny. The volume of corroboration was too large, too many independent accounts, too many matching details, too much documentation. Behind the scenes, plea discussions were briefly considered and quietly abandoned. Prosecutors believed the case was stronger than anticipated. They wanted it on the record, fully exposed, fully tried. As preparations moved forward, one fact became impossible to ignore. The officers had not been stopped by internal oversight. They had not been caught through audits or supervision. They had not been flagged by complaints. They had been caught because someone documented the encounter and refused to let it go. And that realization changed how investigators framed the final phase of the case. The question was no longer whether convictions were possible. It was how much of the truth would be allowed to surface once the courtroom doors finally opened. As the trial date approached, pressure began coming from every direction at once. Defense attorneys filed motion after motion, each designed to fracture the case before it ever reached a jury. They challenged the legality of the searches. They argued the dash camera footage had been improperly obtained. They claimed the victims were unreliable, motivated by regret or fear rather than fact. Each motion was framed as procedural, but the intent was clear. Delay, complicate, exhaust. Prosecutors responded methodically. Every piece of evidence was revalidated. Every warrant was re-examined. Investigators retraced their steps to ensure nothing could be dismissed on technical grounds. The case had grown too large, too visible, to risk collapse over process. Outside the courtroom, the atmosphere shifted. Media coverage intensified. Headlines began using words that had previously been avoided: extortion, corruption, abuse of power. Community leaders demanded transparency. Police unions issued guarded statements emphasizing due process. City officials distanced themselves from the officers without fully condemning them. Victims were notified of upcoming testimony schedules. For many, this was the first moment the consequences felt real. Some hesitated. Some asked again whether their names would be made public. A few considered withdrawing altogether. Prosecutors met with them individually, explaining what would happen, what protections existed, and what the record already contained with or without their testimony. Most agreed to proceed. The defense strategy became clear during pretrial hearings. They did not deny the recordings existed. Instead, they reframed them. They argued the officers were engaging in informal problem-solving, that the language used was misinterpreted, that no explicit demand had been made, that the absence of a specific dollar amount created reasonable doubt. That argument lasted until the audio was played in court. The room changed immediately. The pauses, the tone, the phrasing. It sounded exactly like what it was, an offer conditioned on silence, a threat wrapped in convenience. Jurors did not need legal interpretation to understand it. Then Brooks testified. He appeared composed, precise, and deliberate. He described the stop without embellishment, focusing on sequence rather than emotion. He explained why he had installed the camera, why he stayed calm, why he did not confront the officers directly. He described the moment he realized the recording mattered more than the argument. Under cross-examination, he was asked why he did not simply refuse and drive away. His answer was brief. Because people in positions of authority expect compliance, and refusing in the moment rarely ends the encounter. That statement lingered. As testimony continued, the defense position weakened. Contradictions surfaced. Officers' earlier statements conflicted with metadata. Claimed timelines failed to match call logs. Explanations shifted under scrutiny. The court recessed for the final time before closing arguments. Outside, the officers avoided cameras. Their families declined comment. The department prepared for the verdict regardless of outcome. Policies were already being revised. Oversight structures quietly adjusted. Inside the courtroom, everything slowed. The case no longer hinged on interpretation. It hinged on judgment, not just of guilt, but of how much accountability the system was willing to impose on itself. By the time the jury was sent to deliberate, one thing was clear to everyone involved. Whatever the outcome, this case would not disappear quietly. And when
on the counts of extortion under color of law and conspiracy to abuse authority, the jury finds the defendants guilty. The court finds that the defendants exploited their positions deliberately and repeatedly, causing significant harm to public.
When the verdict came, it would carry consequences far beyond the two officers at the center of it. The verdict came on the fourth day of deliberations. By that point, the courtroom had emptied of speculation. The evidence no longer belonged to prosecutors or defense attorneys. It belonged to the record. The jury returned quietly, without hesitation. and delivered a decision that reflected what had been unfolding since the very first recording was played. Both officers were found guilty on multiple counts, including extortion under color of law and conspiracy to abuse authority for financial gain. Sentencing followed weeks later. The court cited the breach of public trust as the most aggravating factor. The officers had not acted in panic. They had not made a single reckless decision. They had exploited their position deliberately, repeatedly, and with confidence. The judge emphasized that the scheme survived not because it was hidden, but because it relied on silence. Each officer received a multi-year prison sentence. Their law enforcement certifications were permanently revoked. Pensions were forfeited. Civil judgments followed soon after, stripping remaining assets tied to the illegal proceeds. The department faced its own reckoning. Supervisors were disciplined. Oversight procedures were rewritten. Dash and body camera policies were tightened. An independent review concluded that the misconduct had been enabled not by a lack of rules, but by a lack of enforcement. Several unresolved complaints were reopened. Some resulted in settlements. Others led to internal reforms that came too late for those affected. For the victims, closure looked different. Some spoke publicly for the first time after sentencing. Their interviews were restrained, measured, and consistent. None described the officers as monsters. Most described them as calm, professional, and convincing. That detail mattered. It explained why so many had complied without resistance.
I didn't record it because I thought something illegal was going to happen. I recorded it because I always do. That's just how I operate. When he said what he said, I knew arguing wouldn't help. I knew the only thing that mattered was making sure.
Do you think they would have stopped if you had?
Ethan Brooks was among the last to speak. He did not frame himself as a hero. He described the recording as a habit, not a strategy, a precaution learned over time. He emphasized that the outcome had nothing to do with status, money, or luck. It came down to documentation and follow-through. The case file closed quietly after that. No dramatic arrests, no public spectacle. Just a final entry noting convictions, forfeitures, and policy changes implemented in response to the findings. But the impact lingered, because the most important lesson did not come from the courtroom. It came from the roadside, long before charges were filed. It came from the moment a person chose to record, to remain calm, and to escalate through proper channels rather than absorb the cost of someone else's abuse of power.
When authority crosses the line, it usually doesn't look dramatic. It sounds calm, reasonable, quiet. That's why people comply. The difference in this case was simple.
If you ever find yourself facing improper pressure, intimidation, or demands from someone acting under authority, document the interaction and call law enforcement immediately. Silence protects misconduct. Records expose it. If this case mattered to you, subscribe for more investigations like this. Leave a like to help this story reach others who need to hear it. And one question remains. If you were in that car with lights behind you and a badge at your window, what would you have done?